Pat Buchanan, syndicated columnist extraordinaire, predicted so much of the failures of globalization over the years, has been warning us about open borders, death of the West, suicide of a superpower, and finally we have a president who said, "Not so fast. We're not ceding the way to China just yet." He joins us now. Hey, Pat, how are you?
Pretty good. A lot of uplifting book titles there, huh?
I know, they were very positive, Pat.
You forgot suicide of a superpower.
No, I mentioned it. I said suicide of a superpower.
Okay.
No. This is
state of emergency.
Yeah, but it was a 911 emergency. But look, you saw what happened with the EU commissioner comes to town and said, "Wait a second, these tariffs aren't going to work too well for us. How can we make a deal?"
Well, that's right, and but it looks like they sort of put off any kind of problems on the automobiles and the rest of it. But, to Paul Ryan's point, tariffs are taxes, but they're taxes on imports. They're taxes on foreign-made goods. They're not on American-made goods. They're optional taxes. You don't pay them if you buy an American-made product. And secondly, tariffs are really what built the United States of America in the 19th century from a country of about 3 million purely agricultural to the greatest industrial power the world had ever seen by the beginning of the 20th century. I mean, there's got to be some kinds of taxes, and what is preferable to me, taxing production is wrong. You tax consumption more than production.
Well, and I think when Paul Ryan starts talking about we have other tools, it's not like we haven't had presidents go to the World Trade Court, try to say, look, we can do things better. It was only the threat of these tariffs that got them to the negotiating table. They couldn't iron out all differences yesterday, but they made an enormous amount of headway, especially for U.S. farmers and certain other trade barriers they've already agreed to reduce. They have this longstanding litigation against Airbus because of the huge subsidies Airbus gets, where Boeing, of course, gets none of that here in the United States. But I think this is extremely positive, and all the naysayers look like complete idiots.
Well, I do think it's the Europeans are the folks we ought to deal with. I don't know how much you've got going down the road. As I saw this morning Germany's got the great trade surplus with us. Germany and Italy, I think, do in Europe. But take your Airbus and Boeing. Airbus didn't exist at the beginning of in the 1950s. A consortium of British, French, Germans, and others got together, subsidized the building of these aircraft for 25 years. They did it really to take the market that was owned entirely by Boeing. And while we were defending Europe, we let that happen. I think also there are various aspects of Boeing planes now, Laura, like I think the wing of this modern jet they've got is built in Japan.
Yeah, well, and of course, China has now gotten into the commercial aviation game.
Sure, they steal your technology and they want to build their airlines. And see, China's the most protectionist country in the last 25 years, and it's moved faster than any other. It's got $375 billion trade surplus with the United States, which I think is probably about 6% of their GDP. And they run these trade surpluses year in and year out. They make their people sacrifice for it. I mean, they manipulate their currency. And the whole objective is China wants to buy the future, and Americans are more interested in the present.
I want to play for you this congressman from Iowa, David Young. He's a Republican. And, we have a long, complicated history of subsidizing America and American farmers, which are now, overwhelmingly owned by big agri, these big corporations. But let's listen to what he had to say.
When it comes to tariffs, I just think that's a bad place to start. I think the president should have started with maybe a World Trade Organization appeal, gaining allied support and isolating China on trade. I think the president needs to sit down with the leader of China. At some point, I think that would be a good idea. I really am concerned about this in the long run and the short term here as well.
Well, first of all, we did. I think the president hasn't been speaking to Xi. Of course they've been speaking.
Exactly, but there's no doubt about it, as you mentioned. Agriculture is really a huge business now, and they're great big farms. A lot of the small farms are gone. We used to lose about 100,000 a year. I remember when I was out in Iowa looked at that annual figure, but there's no doubt about it. And clearly, we dominate the world market agriculturally because of the huge production we have, and the rest of it. And they're the ones, I guess, that feel they're going to suffer. And the Chinese know what they're doing. The real question for America, I think, is, and we're going to find it out in politics, is whether Americans can sustain the kinds of sacrifices that are going to be needed, and temporary sacrifices, in order to make us economically independent again and self-sufficient again. And if it can be made in America, it should be made in America. All of these principles on which Trump ran, and I think are correct, but there's no doubt. I mean, Hamilton tried to make America independent of Great Britain because he saw what had happened to us when we depended on the British for everything. And the country had to sacrifice a number of those years, and when we did, we wound up independent and taking the European markets and taking the British markets, as I said, becoming a great power. But if you're not prepared to sacrifice, and they say, well, the price of this went up down at Walmart, and so we got to drop this idea of tariffs, it's going to be hard to regain that independence ever again.
Yeah, the question is will Americans be all right with that? And they're out there in Iowa, all these reporters interviewing farmers. I mean,
and the Post is running around, find somebody who's angry about the tariffs, and we'll put them on the air.
Right? Yeah.
So the journalists do. It's a very hard thing, and I saw your comments on Trump, and I think you're exactly right. I mean, the guy is really trying. He's really fighting. He's like a fighter in a ring who's throwing wild some punches, but he's in there, and he's basically your guy doing the things he said he would do, and he's fighting. And I wish him well, but he's got a very tough slog. I think he's got the country really with him on the immigration issue, but on the trade issue, to get back to where we ought to be, it's going to be a tough go.
Well, yeah, man, I'm looking at the glass half full, Pat. I mean, because without Trump, it was over. I mean, without Trump, it was China's
exactly
to take. So I'm very positive. I mean, I would never have predicted we would have gotten as far as we've gotten in the first 18 months of Trump. I mean, we could very well have something very close to 5% GDP tomorrow morning.
Well, that would be phenomenal. But there's three things that Trump he did. He was going to get us out of these wars, and no more of these foolish wars that the Bush people and the Obama people got us into in the Middle East. Second, he's going to secure the border and stop the invasion of the country from the South. And third, he's going to put an end to these $800 billion trade deficits, which are debilitating the country and really which are forfeiting our future for us, where it's a mark of a great power's decline when it continues to run year in and year out. It buys more abroad than it sells more abroad, and it spends more at home than it takes in at home in terms of taxes. And Trump was the great hope here, and he still is. But I'd like to ask you, who else in the Republican Party shares his sort of fighting spirit and determination?
Well, what I hope and what I'm arguing for is that there is no way forward for the GOP other than this conservative populism and economic nationalism. There's no future.
If you go back to they try to go back to open borders and free trade deals, and deficits are just trade deficits don't matter. And let's get in, try to rearrange the Middle East and make it democratic. If you get into another major war over there with Iran, I think it's very problematic for the Republican Party and for its future and for the president.
Now, that would be the sure way. That would be the sure way for us to lose all the gains that we've made. Get mired into another military conflict. I mean, I think Trump wants to get out of Syria. He wants our 2,000 troops out of there. He wants to bring them home. So that's why he wants to do that deal with Russia, where we can still protect Israel and make sure that Iran doesn't set up their little Hezbollah camps right near the southwestern border there.
The Israelis are negotiating that themselves, but I think the Israelis can very much defend themselves in Syria and in southern Lebanon, and even with the Russians. And the Russians don't want an extended war, so I think they want the Iranians 100 miles or 100 kilometers away from the Israeli border.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Pat, the Wall Street Journal, the other Republicans like Bob Corker, they're forever, concerned about getting too close to Vladimir Putin. Like that's gonna, like that's gonna alter U.S. foreign policy forever.
What are they afraid of?
Yeah. Well, let's listen to what Bob Corker said yesterday to Mike Pompeo.
President Trump held a summit with Vladimir Putin. In the summit's aftermath, we saw an American president who appeared submissive and deferential. We've heard that some agreements were reached, but as of yet have little idea what those might be, even though the president has already extended an invitation to Putin to come to Washington to discuss the implementation, quote, quote, of these undefined agreements.
Your reaction?
Well, I mean, the first, it's that this country, some 2 or 3 years after the hacking into the emails of Podesta and the DNC, that we're still caught up and transfixed with this stuff suggests really a real emphasis on the trivial. Get over it. They did it, okay? It's done. As for any deal that Trump made with Putin, first, I doubt it. Secondly, he's going to have to announce it, and we can all know it then, and we can all argue about it and debate it. There's nothing I know that Donald Trump can conceivably do. He's going to send troops somewhere that that we're not going to find out about it, and we can debate. And this is the way Trump deals with the Putin. He wants to talk to him one-on-one. So I really don't know with regard, I just don't know why these people are so upset and unsettled by the fact that Trump sat down with Vladimir Putin.
Well, again, to me, the idea of keeping this perpetual death struggle with Russia when China...
Russia at one point in the Cold War, controlled half of Europe. It had bases in Cuba and Vietnam. It had a mighty fleet around the world. Now the Soviet Empire's gone. The Soviet Union has disappeared. It's broken up into 15 countries. The Warsaw Pact is dead. Its army is back near the Ural Mountains. And it's no longer communist, and Putin apparently has got a soft spot for the Orthodox religion. It is not an ideological enemy as it was, and it is not a world global empire adversary of the United States, but it's got all these nuclear weapons. Look, and if Reagan could get along with the Russians and Nixon could get along with them, why is it so wrong? And they were communists and Bolsheviks and the rest of it. Ike had Khrushchev over here a couple of years after he made a bloodbath of Budapest. And if all those presidents could deal with Russia when it was really a horrendous menace, why can't Trump sit down with Vladimir Putin, who leads a Russia smaller than it was at the time of Peter the Great?
No, it's completely insane. But the Republicans managed to sneak this vote in yesterday in the Appropriations Committee that would, when you game out the numbers, Pat, on immigration, it would ultimately allow 32 million Central Americans, mostly Central Americans, to perhaps come to the United States as asylees. That happened yesterday, which I'm going to get into tonight on the Ingram angle. But you can always count on the Republicans to screw things up at the 11th hour, try to sneak something in to help the Open Borders Coalition.
Politically, culturally, socially, politically, this is an invitation to suicide for the Republican Party. Unless you think that Central American folks want to get here, they're all going to turn into, conservative Republicans. What are they doing? Do the American people want this? Have the American people been asked to vote on this or decide on this? What's their opinion on this? It's the Republican Party, of course. This is why Trump was nominated. The Republican grassroots and the Republican base were fed up with the Bushite leadership that took us into all those wars and would not secure our border and was running around preaching amnesty and getting huzzas from the Washington Post for it.
Yeah, well, the asylum stuff is just completely out of control. It is overwhelming our system, costing hundreds of millions of dollars just this year. We don't have the cash for it. We certainly don't have the public support of all these people coming into the country. It's a total disaster. Pat, it's always great to have you on. Thank you so much for your insights, as always.